Losing a loved one from the late stages of HIV and AIDS presents its own challenges. I would like to honor some members of the community that have been lost to this disease and lived through it, and highlight some of the history that led to life-saving medical advancements that we have today. When experiencing grief, it is normal to feel a list of hard emotions, and even conflicting ones. Anger, sadness, relief, all can be felt when someone dies from complications of this illness. When someone asks, "How are you feeling?" it's essential to remember there is no wrong answer. David Lee Dean, Kathy Black, and Holly Barlow Austin all came from different areas and walks of life. David was an avid social worker, Kathy was an escort, and Holly was a homemaker. Often throughout the history of HIV, it has been referred to as gay cancer, GRID, or gay pneumonia. But this illness can affect anyone, not just gay men. But gay men have suffered the most due to negligence and homophobia. The virus has affected millions of people worldwide and was first documented in the United States in 1980. In its original appearance, it was diagnosed as a carcinoma or pneumonia. More and more gay men became diagnosed with this same immunodeficiency, which is where the derogatory terms came from. It is important to note that the disease was largely diagnosed first in gay men, and that this did not mean it only affected gay men. As the years would pass, incredible medical advancements would be made that saved lives of men and women affected by HIV. But in our celebration, we must not forget those that have been lost over the years. Kathy Black. Kathy was an active sex worker at the beginning and rise of the HIV pandemic, but I must make it known that Miss Black passed away from cervical cancer and not from AIDS, but she did live through the crucial moments of the AIDS pandemic. In the early 80s, Kathy was not concerned about HIV and AIDS because it was propagated as gay cancer and a disease that was only affecting homosexuals. But Kathy soon realized that HIV could affect anyone, as 2 of her female coworkers contracted the virus. Kathy, after her friends became ill, took a tighter grip on her clientele, making sure they had been tested recently if they were bisexual or drug users. Back then, when Kathy was active in sex work, the disease was called GRID. But as time passed, she saw more and more women contract the illness, and it was proof to her that it wasn't just gay pneumonia or gay cancer. She stated at first people didn't even know they had it, which is why Kathy believed it spread like wildfire. She relays how the disease advanced: rapid weight loss, weeping sores, random loss of consciousness, and inability to control bodily functions. Kathy also says that this is the most terrifying, largest, "we don't care about the people" evidence that the U.S. government ever blatantly showed the people of the United States. The government did not care about the virus until people in the government started to contract the virus, and by that time it was too late for most people. Sex work became a day-to-day risk that unnerved her as she witnessed so many people, including people she didn't work with, succumb to the virus. She says that IV drug users caught the disease quickly, and it wasn't until then did most of them start to use separate needles. Everyone at the time was unsure how the disease spread, so people started avoiding others completely, if they even knew someone with HIV or AIDS. Soon, Kathy would leave sex work to minimize her risk of contraction, but she'll never forget the protest, the way the disease stripped everything from the people who had it, and that the government is to blame for how many people died. At this time, I would like to note that on May 11th of 1982, you see the first mention of the term GRID, which stands for Gay-Related Immunodeficiency, in the New York Times. This is attributed to being part of the reason why the public thinks AIDS only affects gay men. In my following interviews, we will see that this simply is not true and contributes to homophobia. Holly Barlow Austin. Holly Barlow Austin was born on May 5th, 1972 in Atlanta, Texas. Holly was a wife, mother, sister, and was HIV positive. You can quickly Google search Mrs. Austin and find numerous articles on her tragic death that occurred June 17th of 2019 at a hospital in Texarkana. Holly was being held in bi-state jail here in Texarkana on the basis of probation violation, and it would mean the end of her life. Holly was HIV positive and needed life-saving medication called antiretroviral therapy. Holly needed this medication to keep her virus levels in her blood at a manageable level. But after her husband brought her the medication in jail, the jail stopped giving her the medication. Later, Holly would develop meningitis and would pass away from complications due to AIDS. Holly was held at bi-state for 3 months for her probation violation. Later, LaSalle Corrections would be held liable for Holly's death for withholding her medications that would have saved her life. LaSalle Corrections was court-ordered to pay Holly's family $7 million, but no amount of money could change the fact that Holly was gone due to neglect and carelessness. I had the privilege of interviewing Holly's cousin, Brooke. Brooke grew up with Holly in her home frequently. Holly was raised by her grandmother because her mother was sexually assaulted and got pregnant as a teenager. So she struggled a lot and had to rely on her mother. Holly's grandmother was hard on her and even blamed her for things that were outside of her control. And Holly turned to drugs and sex work as a result and contracted HIV. Holly's story is hallmarked by the lack of compassion she received from different periods of her life. It is our jobs as funeral directors to be compassionate to every family that walks through our doors, and Holly's family is the perfect example as to why we need to lead with empathy. It is at this time that I would like to note in August of 1981, there are 108 cases of KS and or PCP. 107 are male, 94% of those men are gay, and 40% of those patients have already died. In our next interview, we will discuss a young man that passed away in 2001. It is because of men like him that we now have the antiretroviral drugs that we have today. David Lee Dean was diagnosed with HIV in 1995. The first antiretroviral therapy medication was approved by the FDA in 1987, which by the time David was diagnosed with HIV didn't mean much. The drug would have prolonged his life, and it did, but David said the drug made him feel worse than the HIV did. David was a loving man that was dedicated to his work with adolescents at Evergreen Life Services. David made these children his life's work, and he loved them like they were his own. I was able to interview his best friend, Jennifer Wagner. Mrs. Wagner had glowing words to say about David. In the 90s, being gay was not as accepted as it is today. So David was not open about his sexuality except to a few close friends, like Mrs. Wagner. David was actually the person that introduced Jennifer to homosexuality. Jennifer described David as just a guy who happened to like guys. David was also an artist who loved to paint. And unfortunately, David did face a lot of adversity in his life, from being abused as a child to being bullied for being a gay adult. Jennifer recalled to me that her and David did love to hang out and sometimes party. David also participated in high-risk behaviors, which is where it is believed he contracted the virus. Later, after being diagnosed with HIV, he moved to Dallas, where he would spend the rest of his life with his partner, Gary. David moved to Dallas because here in Texarkana, being gay was not as accepted as it was in Dallas, and unfortunately, David was beat up a time or two while living here. David died in the arms of Gary, with Jennifer by his side, as In the Arms of an Angel by Sarah McLachlan played in the background. I asked Jennifer about her grief that she experienced, and even though David passed away in 2001, Jennifer was still able to tell me about how she felt during this trying time. Jennifer told me when David was first diagnosed, he showed up to her house and couldn't say a word. And he laid his head on her shoulder and he just sobbed. She knew he had gone for the test, so she knew what had happened. At this point in the 90s, the ART made you terribly sick, so David would not take his medication like he was supposed to. Jennifer clung to David after his diagnosis so she could get every second that she could with him. Jennifer still grieves this loss of her dear friend today. She told me she wishes that current ART treatment existed back then, because back then if you got HIV, you died. With current ART treatments, HIV is not the death sentence it used to be. Jennifer also experienced multiple losses at the time, which complicated her grief. For a long time, Jennifer suppressed her grief, but she went to therapy and was able to work through her grief in a healthy way. Jennifer never hid the fact that she lost her best friend through AIDS, and her family was very accepting of her grief, but she would eventually hear what everyone has heard about the disease, that they got what they deserved. Homophobia is common in this area, so it's not coming as a shock to me that she heard people say this. Homophobia is still a part of society today, but society also comes together in beautiful ways, and in this form of the Names Project. In my presentation, I have included photos of the deceased. Unfortunately, in David's case, I could not acquire any photos, so in place of his picture, I included a snapshot of the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. Today, the quilt is over 1 million square feet large and features 50,000 panels and over 110,000 names of people who have died from HIV and AIDS since 1980. The first panel was created by Cleve Jones in honor of his friend Marvin Feldman. The panels are 3 feet by 6 feet long, as we would recognize it as the shape of a grave plot. The AIDS Memorial Quilt is a heart-wrenching project to look through. It is through this project we can remember those we have lost. At this time, I would like to take a moment of silence for David, Holly, and Kathy. And if you would reflect on the stories that I've shared with you, I would greatly appreciate it. In conclusion, I would like to thank you for listening to me share these stories of these pivotal moments in history, and for taking a moment to remember those that we have lost. I hope this reflection shows compassion and empathy. Through anything in life, it does not diminish our humanity, and we must move first with kindness and empathy. And here are my sources. My first source is about Holly Barlow Austin. My second source is HIV.gov. Just about what is HIV, what is AIDS. My third source is also from hiv.gov, and it is the AIDS timeline ranging from 1981 to 2024. And then my last 3 sources are my 3 interviews that I conducted. Thank you.